Welcome to the Safety Share, a webinar series brought to you by CIM Magazine and the CIM Health and Safety Society. I am your organizer, Michelle Beacom, Managing Editor of CIM Magazine, and today's presentation is Supporting Women in Mining, Reproductive Health, Birth Outcomes, and Breastfeeding, and is sponsored by B2Gold. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. To ensure you have optimal audio, if you joined by computer audio, please make sure you've selected the computer audio button. If you dialed in on your phone, please make sure you've selected the phone button. And if you have any questions during the presentation, type them into the GoToWebinar control panel question box, which is underneath the question mark. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We are excited to be partnering with the Health and Safety Society to be able to bring this series to you. And I'm very happy to have Brian with us to host today. Brian, the Northern Ontario market leader at WSP, has more than 20 years of experience with the mining industry. He is currently chair of CIM's Health and Safety Society. Welcome, Brian.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, today we've got a really great presentation. I've had the benefit of getting to see a couple times now, and I thought it was a really important topic because it's one that's not often discussed in the industry, and you know, not always easy to get answers around, you know, planning to be a parent, especially for the women in our industry. So I'll introduce Courtney. Courtney's my colleague. Courtney and I have had the chance to work together for, I don't know, probably about 8 years or 9 years now. I don't know. Anyways, it's been a while. She's great. She's amazing. She's going to share her personal experience with this, as well as all the information she's learned along the way. So, Courtney, do you want to just dive right in here?
Yes, thanks, Brian. Okay. Everyone can see my screen there.
Yes, I can confirm it's up.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so hi everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. I want to give you a little bit of background on how I got involved and interested in this topic. So as a health and safety consultant and a certified industrial hygienist, we get some requests to do assessments for pregnant workers on mine sites. They come in quite irregularly and basically on an as-needed basis. And I found it quite challenging to do these assessments because there's a lack of data out there. And while I was getting these requests, I was also interested in becoming pregnant myself. So I really delved into the research to try to figure out, you know, where this information is, if there is any. And yeah, realized that, you know, even as a CIH, a certified industrial hygienist, I was having a problem. So likely a lot of other people were having problems doing risk assessments for pregnant and breastfeeding workers at mine sites. So this presentation, as Brian said, is partly, you know, me compiling information to try to do these risk assessments as best as possible. A little bit about my own experience doing risk assessments for myself, because I've had now 2 pregnancies and I've been on mine sites during both of them. And so I'll talk about some of the hazards that have come up for me and how I've dealt with that. And yeah, this topic has garnered a lot of interest over the last couple of years, just because there's such a lack of information out there. So I've actually presented this topic quite a few times, like over 10 times in the last couple of years. And so yeah, I'm excited that everyone is here to join me again. Okay, so these are the objectives. We're going to define what a reproductive hazard is. We're going to discuss the rights of a worker regarding their reproductive health and protective reassignment during pregnancy and breastfeeding. We're going to summarize why pregnant and breastfeeding workers are at a greater risk to workplace hazards that are not often reflected in epidemiological research. We're going to talk to you about how to locate resources to identify, assess, and control reproductive hazards in mining. And then lastly, we're going to talk about incorporating reproductive hazards and health and safety management programs at your site. So this is the agenda for today. These are the different topics that we're going to be exploring. And this is me on the right side with a colleague. I think I'm like 32 weeks pregnant underground, which is not a typical site, but all was well, and I was safe going down there. Okay, first things first, human rights and protective reassignment. So across the legislation in Canada, there's legislation that protects individuals from being discriminated against based on sex. And so this requires employers to give women equal opportunity in the workplace. And, you know, this seems like an easy thing to do, especially nowadays, whenever, you know, workplaces are becoming more equal. But, you know, it's harder said than done, actually, and I'll go through some of the reasons why. So having a baby and raising them requires a lot of energy and a lot of effort, from the body making the baby to birthing the baby, to feeding and taking care of the baby and also raising the child. And the women typically do most of this work. And so they should not be discriminated because of this. But it's looked at like quite an inconvenience. So like the women typically takes more time off for maternity leave, but also takes most of the parental leave that's available in Canada. They take a lot more sick time to be with the baby whenever they're sick, or the child as they grow up. They have less ability to take overtime, less ability to travel. And so all of these factors, you know, influence the hiring, what sort of projects that women get put on. So it's important to think about this. And yeah, so on to protective reassignment. In Canada, protective reassignment is legislated by a province and territory, and so it's quite different. Well, there's specific legislation that's different across Canada, and Brian's put a link in there where you can search the summary of the legislation that's associated in each Canadian jurisdiction. But there's four main pillars of protective reassignment responsibilities for the employer and the worker. So we're going to go through those, and they remain quite similar. So first of all, it's the employer's duty to inform workers of their right to protective reassignment. It's the worker's duty to notify the employer that they are pregnant, considering having a baby, or are nursing. And we'll talk a little bit about workplace disclosure and some of the barriers around that, and when it's the best to disclose pregnancy in terms of like your worker's health. The third responsibility is the employer's responsibility to assess the worker's employment duties or training activities and the impact it would have on their pregnancy and reproductive capacity, the health of the breastfeeding child. So the employer has to do a risk assessment essentially to see if protective reassignment is necessary. And then it's the responsibilities of both parties, the employer and the worker, to discuss options available to the worker and where reasonable to do so, modify the duties and the activities of the employee. But it's very important to include the worker in these discussions, because as we'll go through some of the hazards, a lot of them, many of them have to do with stress on the body, and it is also stressful to move someone out of their trained role into a modified role. So sometimes, there's input that's required on the worker's part as to, what's preferable to them based on the hazards of the workplace. And yeah, it's important to note that a lot of workers can stay in their trained role, sometimes with a few modifications during pregnancy and breastfeeding. It's not necessary just to take them completely out into a different role. And the role should be meaningful, and that should be the case in any type of protective reassignment, but especially during pregnancy and breastfeeding, where it's quite a a time full of change that's very stressful. Keeping someone in their trained role, you know, if it's possible and healthy and safe, is the best way to do it. Okay, a little bit more on protective reassignment here. When to tell your employer you are pregnant. This is a personal choice, and you know, you don't need to tell your employer that you're pregnant. Typically, you know, at some point it becomes obvious. But you know, if the woman feels safe and feels supported, the best time to disclose is actually whenever you're planning on becoming pregnant. And that's because even before you know that you're pregnant, you typically know you're pregnant like 5 to 6 weeks pregnant. Your fetus is going through rapid development this time before you know you're pregnant. And so it's important to get protective reassignment and do a risk assessment beforehand so that you're not putting yourself or your unborn baby at risk during that really critical early period. The other thing is too, in the mining industry, you might have a little bit of a hard time conceiving if you and your partner or just you are in fly in, fly out situations. And that's because it actually, you're only able to conceive around 7 days out of the month. And so you really have to line up your schedules in order to become pregnant. So you might need a little bit of help with scheduling to even become pregnant. That being said, confidentiality is really important. So you can disclose to your supervisor or, you know, the medical department on site, but they are not to tell, you know, everyone else that you're pregnant. That's up to the worker. You know, you might have to disclose your pregnancy to certain people who are in charge of modifying your duties or protective reassignment, but confidentiality is really important whenever disclosing pregnancy. And everyone on the call might not be aware that it actually is a lot of times an uncomfortable topic to disclose pregnancy in the workplace. And that's exacerbated, you know, in mining and other male-dominated industries where, you know, you already stick out like a sore thumb being a woman. And if you're a pregnant woman on a mine site or an industrial site, that makes it even more awkward or harder for you to disclose. I was at a Women in Steel conference, and a lot of people told me that the women who work like on the active floor, in active areas of the steel manufacturing industry, prefer not to tell anyone they're pregnant, just to not, you know, put more of a spotlight on themselves. So there's a lot of issues with, you know, culture. And I think we're going in the right direction, but it's important to note that there's a lot of reasons why women feel uncomfortable disclosing. And that also has to do with, you know, discrimination bias. You might be taken off certain projects, overlooked for promotions, those types of things. You also, you know, might have a hard time disclosing because of previous pregnancy loss or complications where, you know, if you disclose early, and it's very common to have a miscarriage early in pregnancy, then you kind of have to tell everyone that you've had a miscarriage, which is also very hard. So it's just important to note that, you know, those are reasons why women might not disclose early and therefore are at risk. And then I always recommend that the worker talks to the healthcare provider and medical services about their jobs and exposures whenever they're, as soon as possible, whenever they feel comfortable, just so they know what services are on site and available to them. So if there is, you know, something that goes wrong on site, especially a remote site, you know what's in store for you. So for example, if you have a later stage miscarriage, you know, how are you going to be brought to the hospital? At least you're prepared and they're prepared for something like that if it happens on site. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about issues in applying standards to women. And so first I'm going to make it very general. Of course, everyone probably is aware that a lot of the occupational exposure limits and standards don't apply to pregnant and breastfeeding women because there's a lot of changes to the body, and, you know, part of it is exposing the child to the hazards as well. But we'll step back a little bit and talk about some of the issues in applying standards to women in general, so you can get a broad sense of the issues here. So the fact that women's bodies and men's bodies don't equal each other seems pretty obvious, but historically, other than women being smaller and having different reproductive systems, the male and the female body was thought to be quite similar. But this is not the case, and there's actually differences in every tissue and organ system in the body. They've found differences through research. And so these differences have major implications in the susceptibility and the course of many diseases and their diagnosis and treatment. And so that puts, women at risk if, most of the research has been done on the male body, which it has. So historically, women have been excluded or underrepresented in health research. And this goes, as deep as animal studies. So there was a 2014 review that found 80% of animal studies that have to do with health research only included male subjects, like male animals in their research. And this goes a little bit further for occupational research because, especially in male-dominated industries like mining, there wasn't a lot of opportunity to include females in the research. And whenever there were opportunities, historically, they were excluded because they are seen as confounding factors. So, it's really important going forward, and this is happening, that women are included in health research and disaggregated by sex. So even if there's only an opportunity to include a few women, do so, disaggregate the results by sex, and then, if we can compile reviews going forward, you can use all the data from all the different studies and come up with the difference in how they might apply to men and women. And I have this reference up here to reference man. He was used in a lot of occupational health research, and it's a Caucasian man aged 25 to 30 years old that weighs 150 pounds, and he was meant to represent humanity, but of course he does not. And there's a lot of limitations there for women and other minorities that might not be reflected in health research and occupational health guidelines. So that's a little bit of background. But of course, whenever we look at a pregnant woman, she deviates even more from this reference man. So she's not accounted for in occupational limits and guidelines even more. So that puts her at higher risk. So it's pretty obvious that the female body changes during pregnancy. There's a lot of changes that everyone might not be aware of, but she has a higher heart rate, her respiratory depth increases, her ligaments, tendons, and other connective tissues soften, putting her at higher risk of MSDs. There's changes in metabolism and the immune system. Her body shape changes as well, so the fit of PPE is always changing, which is a challenge, and that includes respirator fit as well. Like your face gets quite a bit bigger a lot of the time as well, so you need to redo your fit test. Make sure the size of respirator is still working for you. And then of course, the fetus also might be exposed to workplace hazards. So a good example is lead crosses the placenta, and so your fetus can get exposed to lead in utero, and therefore there's a lot of considerations for protecting the fetus as well as the pregnant worker. And that is also the case for the breastfeeding woman. So she's not commonly accounted for in occupational limits and guidelines. And contaminants can get into the breast milk and expose the child. Not all the time, but there is contaminants that do go into the breast milk, and I'll show you how to determine that later on. The other thing about breastfeeding is you have to be flexible. When the worker comes back to work and they're still breastfeeding, you need to be able to provide designated private space for women to express milk or pump milk. And then if they're going to be keeping the milk, which they probably do because it's a lot of work to pump and express milk, you'll need a place to store that breast milk. And then if you have a remote site, and you'll have to provide shipment to home as well. Okay, now we're going to go over how to define reproductive hazards. So a reproductive hazard is an agent that can adversely affect the reproductive health of women and men, and or can negatively impact the growth and development of a fetus. So it's important to note here that there are female reproductive hazards and male reproductive hazards. We're focusing on the female ones, but they can be very different, for men and women, different types of hazards. And some examples of the health effects associated with reproductive hazards are infertility, miscarriages, preterm labor, low birth weight, and birth defects in the baby. And another good definition to know is a teratogen, and that's an agent that interferes with normal fetal development and causes birth defects. And because mutagens and carcinogens have a similar mechanism of action, they should be included also as a reproductive hazard. And this is because, the fetus is growing very rapidly through cell division, and so the DNA is more susceptible to damage from these types of agents. So whenever you're identifying a reproductive hazard, it's a good idea to look at your STS sheet, and the agents that are in these health hazard classes, women's health hazard classes, can be defined as a reproductive hazard. So that's ones that are labeled reproductive toxicity, germ cell mutagenicity, and carcinogenicity. So that's a really good way of anticipating and identifying what sort of reproductive hazards that you have at your site. So this is a really good step to do, before you even have a pregnant or breastfeeding worker on site. You have a list in your risk register, most likely, of all of the different hazards. Just go and designate whether or not they're a female or a male reproductive hazard or not, and then you'll be ahead of the game and proactive about making your workers aware, but also as a health and safety professional, you'll be aware of where your reproductive hazards lie. And another really good way of doing this too is looking at the WorkSafe BC table of exposure limits, and I think Brian just put the link in the chat there, so you can have a direct link to that. And what they did was they went through all of the literature, and they determined whether or not all of the chemicals in their list of exposure limits were a reproductive hazard or not. And if they were, they put a reproductive hazard notation or an R notation in their column. And so that's another really good way of identifying whether or not you have a reproductive hazard or not at your site. Okay, so how do you evaluate and control these hazards? This is where it becomes a little bit more tricky because of the lack of research and occupational exposure limits that are out there. But these are two of the best resources that I have found, and these are the ones that I use whenever I'm doing assessments. So the first one there is Laurentian University and Workplace Safety North's A Guide to Healthy Pregnancies in the Mining Workplace. So that's the picture that you can see up there. This is a great resource to go to. I would use it as your #1 resource. It was published in 2012 there. Brian just has the link up. Thanks, Brian. It was published in 2012, so there's a few publications that have come out since then, and I'll go over those. But it lists 34 different hazards, including physical, chemical, ergonomic, and psychosocial hazards that are common in mining that are also reproductive hazards. And they go over the specific health effects that might be associated with the pregnant worker, the fetus, and the child during breastfeeding. And then it provides guidance, values, and controls that can be used to control the risk on site. And then the second one is NIOSH has a page that's called About Reproductive Health in the Workplace, and there's 17 different reproductive hazards on there, and there's lots of good information there as well. So you can use both if you're doing an assessment or coming up with a pregnancy and breastfeeding control plan. Okay, so I'm going to go over some of the common mining hazards and some of the information that's available. I don't have a lot of time here, so I'm going to focus on the ones that are bolded. And these ones I've picked because they require a little bit more knowledge than, you know, just what's in some of the resources that I just went over. And there's been a few publications since that contribute to how you would do the assessment and control in your workplace. Yeah, we'll start with noise. So noise is not the typical reproductive hazard that you might think of, but of course noise can, go through the woman's uterus and, affect the fetus. And so the fetus can get hearing loss, and it doesn't work for the pregnant worker just to put on hearing protection. The sound is going through the uterus as opposed to through the worker's ear canal. So over here on the left, it says the fetus can have, hearing impairment from exposure, low birth weight and preterm delivery, and so the occupational exposure limits that are associated with hearing impairment in the fetus is, beyond the 5th month of pregnancy, the worker shouldn't be exposed to continuous noise above 150 decibels, C-weighted decibels, or peak exposures of 155 C-weighted decibels. And so this is very high, but it's good to know, and there's good that there's actually some published guidance on this. And so a lot of times this is not a problem. I've seen exposures this high in mining, but they're very uncommon. So a lot of times, the worker is safe to be going underground, and it won't lead to your fetus having hearing impairment. This picture is me at 5 weeks pregnant, actually before I knew I was pregnant, but I felt good about knowing that there's this published guidance and exposure limit. And so I felt safe going underground and getting exposed to noise above 85 dBA, but below 115, 155 dBc. So it's important to note here that the action to avoid the risk to the mother, so this is the common noise occupational exposure limit of 85 dBA in an 8-hour period. This has to do with increased risk of pregnancy-induced hypertension. So essentially it's stressful to hear noise above 5 dBA for 8 hours. So this can be controlled through hearing protection, if you can't control it any other way. So you can be safely working in noise areas that are, from 85 to 115 decibels, essentially. And then a quick note about breastfeeding. So we talked about this earlier, but if you are breastfeeding at work, still breastfeeding whenever you return to work and you want to pump or express milk at the workplace, you need to be doing that in a quiet, comfortable space, because you need to feel relaxed and you need to have oxytocin release for you to be able to produce milk and, get something whenever you pump or express. And this is quite an easy thing to do, like just have a designated, office for workers to go into where they won't be disturbed whenever they're breastfeeding. But I've been told by a lot of workers that, this just didn't come up, or they didn't provide a place and they didn't want to ask for one. So they ended up pumping or expressing in the bathroom, which, just doesn't work very well. You just won't, be able to pump a lot of milk because you're not in a quiet, comfortable space. So an easy way to support women at your workplace by providing them a place to pump or express milk. Okay, so the next one is whole body vibration. And interestingly, this is the #1 request we get for pregnancy-related risk assessments during my career. And it's because a lot of women operate like heavy machinery and equipment at mine sites nowadays. And so it's quite a common risk during pregnancy. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of data available out there. So there is some research available that suggests that miscarriages and preterm deliveries are more common whenever you're exposed to whole body vibration. And same with increased risk of uterine blood flow, increased risk of preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure during pregnancy, and then increased risk of compression, stress, and strain on the spine for the pregnant worker. But since there's not a lot of data out there, a safe limit to avoid higher risk could not be derived from literature. So what we do whenever we do assessments is we compare the whole body vibration exposures. So there's assessments done on site where you collect data and see what the exposure is, and then we compare it to something that you might do routinely during your, your regular day outside of work. So for example, driving a passenger car, there's lots of published data on what your exposure would be during that. So if it's, around the same or definitely lower, then likely protective reassignment is not necessary. Okay, the next one is ionizing radiation. And so this one is probably, top of mind whenever it comes to reproductive hazards, whenever you think about it. And there are a lot of published limits for pregnant workers to ionizing radiation. So that's really good. They're all here on the right side here. And, Canada has the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission has one where your exposure limit is 4 millisieverts after disclosure of pregnancy, but there's a bunch of other ones too. And so it's important to note, though, the reason why I brought this one up is because your exposure to different pathways of ionizing radiation makes a difference on whether or not they affect the fetus. So external gamma radiation is the one that you have to be more worried about in this case, as opposed to exposure from alpha particles whenever you're breathing them in from radon. So if you're in an underground mine and you're really only exposed to radon, that's not going to be an increased risk to the fetus because the alpha particles get trapped in your lung, and then it's your lung that gets irradiated. So just something to keep in mind. Yeah, and then over here on the right, this is me at 23 weeks pregnant, and I think I went back at 30 weeks pregnant. I went to a closed uranium mining facility, and it was actually quite easy for me to do an assessment because of all these great published limits. And so I was able to ask the site supervisor, what sort of levels of radiation that I would be exposed to whenever I was on site, and I can do a calculation, and I made sure that it was well below all of these limits. So that's an easier one. So for lead, we talked a little bit about this before. Lead crosses the placenta, so it can be very hazardous to the fetus. It can contribute to stillbirths, preterm deliveries, and birth defects, including neurological damage. And it is also excreted in the breast milk. But I brought this up because there was publications from the US CDC in 2010 that provided guidance on blood lead levels for pregnant workers, and then also blood lead levels for recommendations for whether or not you should breastfeed depending on what your blood lead levels are. And so this isn't reflected in that main guidance from Laurentian University, so that's why I wanted to put this up here. So it's important to know that these are here, and if your workers on site are exposed to lead, you can take blood lead levels and compare it to these, and there's something at least to help you with your risk assessment to determine whether or not pregnant workers are at risk at your workplace. Okay, I also wanted to touch on parental leave because it's a big part of supporting women in the workplace. Properly paid Parental leave is, a huge indicator of whether or not women can be retained in the workplace. And of course, in Canada, we have some pretty protective laws surrounding parental leave, but there's a few considerations that I'll go through that really help supporting women and retaining women in mining and in industry. So it's known that women drop out of industrial workforces at an earlier age than men. And the reasons why this happens is because they cite inappropriate prenatal and parental policies. They might not want to take a job in mining because they know that, prenatal risk assessments and protective reassignment might not be something that's well managed at the workplace. And then also the lack of support to parents with childcare responsibilities. So touching on this again, women do the majority of unpaid childcare and household work. So whenever you go to site after that, it's a lot of work. And so you might, be less inclined to come back full time. And if you're still breastfeeding, you might have issues around continuing to breastfeed safely whenever you're back on site. And so all of this research actually was compiled into this document called Parental Leave Policies in the Mining Sector. So if you're interested in learning more about this, you can go and read this report. So the optimum length that they've figured out in this research for parental leave, paid parental leave, is at least 7 months. This is, of course, a very personal decision to make, and a lot of different factors go into, how much time you're going to take. Most global mining companies were found to provide a minimum of 18 weeks, 4.5 months, and all provide for 5 to 20 days of paternity leave, which is good as well. And so a comment here on paternity leave. So paternity leave where, the non-birthing parent or, most often the father takes leave is gaining traction around the world. But it's more important than a lot of people might think in retaining women in the workplace. And this quote by the International Labour Organization really highlights this. They say the development of paternity leave policies and the increase in the sharing of caregiving between parents is considered one of the most significant social developments of the 21st century. So it's actually really important, and that's because whenever the non-birthing parent or the father stays home with the child, it really helps with the division of unpaid labor afterwards. So a lot of times, if that happens, they help a lot more with the household chores and the unpaid childcare afterwards. And it also helps, with discrimination and equal opportunity in the workplace for women. They come back earlier. It's less inconvenient as people think for women to take so much time off. And there's a lot of variables that go into that, but that's why it's so significant to encourage parental leave policies and also provide adequate pay for the men taking leave. Okay, so barriers and the path forward. We've talked a little bit about the barriers. Another barrier we haven't talked about is that requirements that women need to benefit from parental leave typically differ from men. So women are more likely to not work full-time hours or be on part-time contracts. So this might not allow them to gain access to all of the parental leave benefits that full-time workers enjoy, especially like any top-ups from the company. Workplace around pregnancy is a challenge. We talked a lot about that in terms of, discrimination and bias, but also issues around women feeling comfortable disclosing pregnancy. Support, there needs to be more support for the transition back to the workplace after parental leave. And I've had a couple people in the mining industry tell me that their company actually helps set up childcare. Or at least connects you with childcare in the area, which is really great since childcare is a really challenging thing to deal with I know a lot of people don't get the childcare that they need whenever they're coming back to work, or have to extend their leave because they don't have it. A note here on communication during leave. So it can be both good and bad. It's best to have a chat, with your employee before they go off on leave to see what their expectations are. Some people like more communication than others. Generally, work-related communication is not as good. It's a very stressful time being on leave, and it's, in my experience and in a lot of other people's experience, it's much harder than actually being at work. So having work on top of that is very stressful. But it can also be good. So for example, like keeping in touch with people at work. So if you're having like social gatherings or workplace dinners, it's good to just invite them in case they want to participate, because it can also be, parental leave can also be quite an isolating experience. And the last point here is changing norms around parental leave and normalizing parental leave for men. So we talked a lot about that, but that will definitely help in retaining women, supporting women, if more men take a little bit of time off. Okay, so the path forward, this is my last slide. Definitely establishing written standards and guidance and having those incorporated into your management system is the best way to go here. Being proactive about it, you can start having a pregnancy and breastfeeding control program before you even have a breastfeeding or a pregnant employee on site. So take all the information that I provided here, anticipate, identify your reproductive hazards, and then make a plan on how to control those. But also training and awareness and leadership support is really important too. So people need to know that, you've done these assessments beforehand. They need to know what sort of reproductive hazards are at the site. So that will also help with, early disclosure of pregnancy or early disclosure of someone, wanting to become pregnant, which is the best time to disclose. And then, workers also need to be aware that, it's the employer's responsibility to do that risk assessment, and the protective reassignment needs to be provided as necessary. You need to have accessible medical and emergency services. So I've had some people talk to me about, having, medical related emergencies on site related to pregnancy, like miscarriages, and it being very stressful for them, and emergency services not being prepared beforehand. So having that conversation with your emergency services on site and is really important to be incorporated into your written standards and guidance. Proper facilities for breastfeeding, and then also personal protective equipment. A greater allowance for PPE whenever you're pregnant, because there's, your body's going through different changes and you might need to upgrade your PPE a few times while you're pregnant on site. And then lastly, we talked about driving research into reproductive hazards and birth outcomes. So if you ever have any opportunity to participate in research, there's a lot of gaps that need to be closed in that area where it's just unknown. It's not known whether or not it's safe or risky. So there's, a lot of instances that I've heard of where people get taken off their trained position, just because there's a lack of data, not necessarily because we know that it's risky. And, that is really difficult and does not help with supporting women on site. So I think that's where I'll leave it off. So I'm happy to take any questions from the audience.
Yeah, that was great, Courtney. Thanks so much. I just wanted to note to everyone who's on the call that all of these webinars that we do for the Safety Share are saved on our YouTube channel. And so I've just put that into the link. And this is one that I really think, will gain a lot of viewership over time, right? Because as this becomes relevant to people, it gives them more access to a lot of the great information that Courtney was able to share here today, and now it will be available for them to access when they need it in their journey. So Courtney, we got a number of questions come in, lots of great response from the audience here. So I'll start going through some of these questions, and we've got about probably a little more than 10 minutes to go through questions before Michelle will come back on and close things out for us. So the first one is, in general, does the medical community have enough knowledge to understand the challenges of working underground in order to provide guidance on potential reassignment options? How much can one rely on that advice?
Yeah, I don't think I can speak specifically to it because I don't have a lot of knowledge, of how much education that physicians get in occupational health, but I don't think it's very comprehensive. I think a lot of times, professionals within the industry know a little bit more about the research that's out there, but because of the lack of research, I think that there's a lot of limitations in the knowledge, both in the medical industry and in the health and safety industry. So I would say get the opinion of both your employer and your healthcare provider, and that's the best really that you can do. But I do think there's a lot of gaps associated with it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, and I think, your comment to going back to the employer, they're the ones that are more likely needing to do that. And if the company is large enough, they may have an occupational physician on board that can speak, maybe a little bit more knowledgeably to it, but clearly some gaps there. The next one is, are there or does there need to be accommodations specifically regarding contaminants for men who are hoping to start a family?
Yeah, so I think that whenever you're creating, maybe it should be a reproductive health and breastfeeding control plan, like more, inclusive. There definitely needs to be a component in there for male reproductive hazards because they are different. The same strategy can be applied for like identifying, assessing, controlling the risks, but you should be anticipating all the male reproductive hazards on your site as well and controlling them in a similar way.
Okay, great. Next one here, a comment first, some great info and data here. In our still male-dominated industry, what are some genuine and thoughtful ways to discuss and support pregnancies with our female colleagues, coming from a male coworker as well as a male supervisor?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think from being a pregnant worker and having pregnant colleagues, just having like holding space to be able to talk about it is really important. Showing that you care. So even if like in a safety share or a tailgate meeting, bringing it up so that people are aware and that you're not uncomfortable talking about it, is something that you can do. And during that time, highlighting, that, if you're thinking about having a family, like please feel comfortable talking to me about it, like in a confidential way, and it's our responsibility to do a risk assessment. So just having little talks like that, whether they're one-on-one or whether they're in a group, can go a long way.
Okay, great. Thanks, Courtney. It's good advice. Next question is, are blood lead levels a specific test that can be administered by a GP, or is that at a hospital? Can it be done at the mines first aid too? So it's kind of, I think what they're looking for is, that blood and lead levels test. Where can that be administered and by who?
Yeah, so I think it could be both. I know that if there's lead at the workplace, they either get their employees to go to, an external lab, or they bring one in. I think it's very dependent on the workplace, but yeah, essentially you just get blood taken and get it analyzed for lead. So that can be done at a lot of different facilities. So yeah, on-site clinics, off-site clinics. Your GP can likely do that as well.
Okay, great. There's a couple comments, and then the last question that I have in here for now. So if anyone else has a last minute question, I just ask that you put it in now. But the last one that we've got in the queue is, what are the common reassignment options that companies explore for pregnant heavy machinery operators?
That is a very good question. I don't know, actually. I typically am not involved in the actual protective reassignment decisions. So yeah, I don't know if you have any knowledge, Brian, or someone else from the audience does, you can make a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would think that the most common reassignment options are going to be those that remove that type of hazard. So typically the main hazard on that one's going to be the whole body vibration. So something on site that would, be considered meaningful, but not in a large piece of equipment that would expose to the same types of vibration levels. So maybe a similar driving or equipment operating job, but in a different location with less vibration.
Yeah, that's a good consideration. Yeah, different type of vehicle has different vibration levels.
Yeah. And then maybe I'll just grab a couple of the comments there. I don't know. From Chloe, we've got, thank you for such a presentation full of useful and practical information. So I couldn't agree more. Good job. I've heard this presentation a couple times now, and it's always, I'm really impressed with how well you communicate these topics. And, I just want to really commend you for putting together this presentation and sharing all this great knowledge that you've got on this, and hopefully making other people's paths a little easier for those that are coming after you with the same types of questions that you had going into this. So thank you for that. And I think there we'll wrap up, and we'll bring Michelle back online.
Thanks, Brian. And thank you, Courtney. That was really an interesting presentation. And I agree with Brian that for it to live on the YouTube channel, to be accessible to people when they need it, because not everybody needs it all the time in the mining industry. So it's really, really useful information. I really appreciate that you gave this presentation. And with that, I'd like to thank you and also give a special thanks to B2Gold for sponsoring today's episode of the Safety Share. I'd like to thank all of our attendees and ask that you please fill out the short survey that pops up on your screen at the close of the webinar. A link to the video recording of today's webinar will be emailed to you tomorrow. We hope you will join us for our next episode of the Safety Share. Keep an eye on the calendar of events at CIM.org for more details. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.